So those of you who may have forgotten, this is what the book looks like, the Four Agreements, and it's 20 years old now that this book has been out. And the reason I chose to talk about this today was, well, threefold. First of all, I think we need a review. This is my personal opinion. We need a review of what these four agreements are, particularly in light of what's been going on in our world today. The divisiveness that is going on that I'm hearing about, I don't know about you folks, but on the news and in the newspapers and whatever. Second thing is, I have found that when I am speaking or teaching, it's because of something I need to learn, or I need to review, or I need to remember. And probably the third thing is, I don't know about you, but at my age, it's easier to remember 4 agreements than 10 commandments, right? So, you may remember Don Miguel Ruiz was a Toltec, which is sort of like the Mayans or the Aztecs, you know, an indigenous people that were wise beyond their years, and they passed down that wisdom through generations. And we are very fortunate that we have some of those individuals who are willing to share that wisdom with us, you know, in our modern culture. So the very first agreement is to be impeccable with your word. Now, we know that words have the power to create. I mean, in the Bible it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by Him," or her, "and without Him was not anything made that was made." So we see, for centuries, people have realized the power of the Word. So, speaking about the Bible, there were these 2 elderly, devoted monks in the 1500s, before the printing press was invented, that were transcribing the Bible. Now, one monk decided to take a look at the original text to make sure that they were transcribing it correctly, you know, after all these years. So he went back into the archives, and about an hour later he came out, and he was just livid. So the other monk asked him what in the world was going on. And the first monk said, "The word is celebrate. Celebrate with an R, not celibate. I can't believe it after all these years." So you see, it's not just the word, it could be one letter that makes the difference in our lives. So this word impeccable comes from the Latin that means, the Latin peccatus, which means sin. And the way Don Miguel explains it is, sin is anything that we do against ourselves or against each other. So impeccable would be without sin, without doing harm to ourselves or to another person. And like I said, our power has the ability to create, just as Jesus used His word to heal the people that He came into contact with, because He recognized that power, that wisdom within Himself, that He could speak His word and it would have an effect. But of course, the word can be a double-edged sword. When we misuse the word, it can destroy and create what we might call hell. Or it can be used to heal, to bring love, joy, peace, harmony, or to create heaven, however we use our word and however we interpret it. Those words can hook our attention and change our beliefs, which then changes our experiences. When we are impeccable with our word, we take responsibility for our actions. In other words, we are in integrity. And I'm sorry, but it's my opinion, we need more integrity in this world today. That's all I'm going to say. Well, I have a couple other things, but these are my opinions. Okay. Now, when we hear someone else's opinion and we accept it, it's like being under a spell. It's like we agree with what they say to us or for us or about us, and becomes part of our belief system. And a lot of times becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't know about you, but I grew up with the saying, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all, right? Right. Yes, yes. Or, as Mark Twain said, when in doubt, tell the truth. We've also heard, I mean, then you don't have to remember what it was you said, what lies you said, you know? When you tell the truth, it's so much easier, right? Mark Twain. Yeah. When in doubt. Yeah. We've also heard, seek the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, there's a reason all of these sayings have existed for so long, because those are things that we need to remember. Because these agreements that we make with ourselves to be impeccable, to not take things personally, etc., are probably some of the most powerful agreements that we can make, because we are responsible for perpetuating these agreements, for fulfilling them, carrying them out. Now, I find for myself, one of the harder things for me to do is this thing called gossip. I normally don't start gossip, and I normally don't perpetuate it or carry it along. But when I'm in the midst of it with coworkers or family members or whatever, it's really hard not to get caught up in it. But gossip is simply another person's opinion of the situation. And the things that they may be reporting may be exactly right, but it's their spin on it that causes the poison, if you will, that gets perpetuated when we perpetuate or pass along the gossip. A lot of times the reason we do gossip and spread it is because we want to perpetuate our point of view, because we think our point of view, our way of looking at the situation, is right. So like I said, we might think of gossip as poison, or another way to look at it is a computer virus. I think we're all familiar with computer viruses. So every time we listen to gossip, it's like allowing or being infected by this computer virus. And you know what happens to our computers when they get a virus? They just go crazy. Well, it's like this poison affects our mind and our way of thinking and behaving and believing. So when we pass on that gossip, it's like passing on that computer virus to the people that we are talking to. So I think that's a great way of looking at this idea of gossip and being impeccable with our word. So hopefully we will stop and think before we pass on any gossip, infect anyone with any poison or computer virus. Now, the second agreement that we heard the song about is don't take anything personally. And that's another one that's pretty hard to do. But stop and think about it. How egocentric is it if we think everything is about us? And like Patsy was singing in this song, it's the other person's opinion that they are projecting onto us. It's not the truth about us. So when someone criticizes or judges us and we accept that, it's like taking in poison or being under a spell. So if we don't take it in, it's like we put up this shield and we are immune to what this other person is saying. So when we agree with what's being said, and by taking things personally, that can really affect our lives. As far as I know, mind reading has not been taught in school. So how can another person know really what's going on in your life, in the other person's life that's maybe criticizing or judging you? Maybe they've had a really bad day or had a fight with their spouse. And even spouses sometimes can't read each other, don't know what's going on. Any of you who are married know what I'm talking about. Oh, it reminds me of the story of a woman who said to her neighbor, you know, I have this marvelous meatloaf recipe. All I have to do is mention it to my husband, and he said, let's go out to eat tonight. Now, some of you may remember from the 1970s, there was a book written by Terry Cole Whitaker entitled, What You Think of Me Is None of My Business. Remember that book? That was very, very popular, very well written. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about. What other people think of us is none of our business. Now, the biggest challenge is when someone is praising us, right? To not take that personally. Well, if we really knew ourselves, we would know that this person, that's their opinion of us, but we would be firm and confident in what we knew was the truth about ourselves, because we are all divine expressions of God, of Spirit, of the Creator, whatever term you want to use. But the greatest teachers in our lives are the ones who push our buttons, because they provide us an opportunity to grow. Darn it. And like I said, you know, I talk about what I need to listen to, what I need to hear, so I'm glad this is going to be on tape so I can re-listen to it. But regardless of our formal education, we are all PhDs, right? Pretty holy dudes.
Oh, I like it.
I really like that. I wish I would have known who said that so I could give that person credit. But when I ran across that, I thought, oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Pretty holy dudes, PhDs. Remember that what other people say about us is their vision, their perspective of the world, and it's not necessarily our truth. But our reaction to what they say, what we do about what they say, that is about us, not about them. So the question is, do we want to be right or do we want to be loving? I have a great story that talks about this idea of not taking things personally. There was a very conscientious wife who tried very hard to please her husband, but she seemed to fail regularly. He seemed to be the most contentious at breakfast time in the morning. So if the eggs were scrambled, he wanted them poached. If they were poached, he wanted them scrambled. So his poor wife she was really dealing with this, and she thought, oh, I know what I can do. She came up with what she thought was a brilliant idea. She scrambled one and poached the other. Perfect solution. So she did that and set the plate in front of him and waited for his approval. So he looks down at the plate and he said, can't you do anything right, woman? You scrambled the wrong one. Hopefully she did not take that personally. See, you're responsible for your reaction to that. So the third agreement, and I know I'm kind of rushing through these so we can get a review of all four of them, is don't make assumptions. And you'll hear a song about that in a little while. Now, we all know what it means to assume. Have you ever seen the word assume written out? Makes an ASS out of you and me. Right. So that's why we don't want to make assumptions. Now, our assumptions may be the opposite of reality, because we're not all impeccable with our word. If we were all impeccable with our word, there would be no need to make assumptions. And when we don't take things personally, it's easier to be impeccable with our word because we aren't offended or getting defensive or trying to please someone. So you see how these agreements all work together to bring about a better life for everyone. When we make assumptions, we misunderstand things and can take them personally and create havoc in our lives. How many times do we make mountains out of molehills rather than asking for clarification, asking questions? Because clarity is power. Clarity is power. As human beings, we have this innate need to understand why someone said this, why someone did that, whatever. So sometimes we come up with explanations that really aren't true, just so we can have an answer that works for us. How many times in school, when the teacher asked a question, rather than asking for clarity about what exactly is it you're asking, because we don't want to feel vulnerable or stupid or whatever, because maybe it's just too embarrassing that we don't know the answer and we're not willing to ask for clarity. So speaking of teachers in school, there was a Sunday school teacher who wanted to talk to her class about hard work and preparation. So she decided to use the example of a squirrel. So she said, I'm going to describe something to you, and when you know what it is, raise your hand. This thing lives in trees and eats nuts. No hands went up. It's usually brown or gray and has a very bushy tail. No hands went up. It jumps from branch to branch. Still, no hands went up. It chatters and flips its tail when it gets excited. Finally, one boy's hand very reluctantly went up, and the teacher called on him, and he said, well, I assumed the answer was going to be God or Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me. See, we can't always make these assumptions. We assume that everyone sees life the same way that we do, but they don't. Everyone is different. Even though we are all expressions of the divine, we are unique expressions of the divine. We've all been raised differently, have had different experiences in our lives. So we can't be expected to be exactly the same and be able to read another person's mind. So assumptions can destroy relationships, whether we're talking about friends or family members or a spouse. The expectations that we have for these relationships, even if it's a boss and an employee, need to be clearly communicated so that there are no assumptions made. Real love means accepting the other person just as they are and not trying to change them. We can't change another person anyway. The other person gets to make that decision as to whether they want to change or not. So the biggest challenge in relationships is assuming that the other person knows what we want, how we feel, what's going on in our lives, and that's not true. That's not true. We need to communicate. So the best way to keep from making assumptions is to ask questions. Get clarity, clear communication between individuals. And the fourth agreement is to always do our best. No more, no less. And our best obviously changes from day to day. And even from moment to moment, depending on, how we're feeling, what's going on. If we're coming down from a joyful experience or a depressing experience or whatever. When we do less than our best, we're subject to judgment and criticism, sometimes from other people, but mostly from ourselves. And guess which criticism and judgment stays with us longer and impacts our life more? If we always do our best, there's no way we can judge ourselves or find fault in what we've done. So there's no way that little monkey mind will keep reminding us of what we did or didn't do when we were not impeccable with our word or carried out what we said we were going to do. There was a traffic officer who pulled over a motorist and demanded to see her driver's license. So the lady pulled out her license, which the officer studied very suspiciously for several minutes before handing it back to her and, telling her it was okay for her to go. His explanation was, you were driving so carefully, I just assumed that you had an invalid license. Obviously, he was not used to people doing their best, making an assumption. But what about when we do more than our best? When we give it 110 or 120%? Well, a lot of times what happens is we end up expending too much energy and we overdo it, which leads to fatigue and burnout, which is not going to help us in the long run. It's not leading to our highest and greatest good. We should do our best because we want to, not to please someone else or to get a reward. If we do end up getting a reward, it's like icing on the cake. But that should not be our motivation to do our best. Remember the little monkey mind, we can shut it off when we do our best. Now, doing our best doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be perfect. I'm sure we've all heard that perfectionists are ones who take great pains and give them to others because everyone else is not a perfectionist. So doing our best is not about the outcome, but it's showing up with full enthusiasm to handle the task at hand or whatever it is that we're working on. So when we accomplish those other 3 agreements, our best will be better than it used to be. And the more we practice all 4 agreements, the more control we have over our lives, and we can live happier and more fulfilled lives. So I invite you now to join me in a meditation so we can take these words in, these 4 agreements, to be impeccable with our word, to not take anything personally, to not make assumptions, and to always do our best. So I invite you to take a couple of minutes to ponder these ideas, to take them in, to make them your own. And maybe later, take some time to journal or just contemplate about how these 4 agreements can make a difference in your life. And so I affirm for each one of us that we are able to take this message today, these 4 agreements, into our heart, into our mind, into our soul, and allow them to percolate, to bring about our highest and greatest good, now and forevermore, for ourselves, for each other, and for the world. Blessings, peace, and so it is. Amen.